being here this morning. I'm going to go over taxes. I know that's exciting to go over on a Tuesday morning, and then how it affects our recapture payments. And so this is our Taxpayer Tuesday series, dates and topics. So today, December 2nd, we're here at Rooster going over taxes and recapture, and we have 3 more in the series. So mark that on your calendar so you all can see those. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm presenting those, so. Okay, I was hoping Karen might be. All right, so our objectives today, to explain how school taxes are calculated. Also to show how appraised values affect tax bills and school funding. To talk about recapture and why Drifting Springs pays it. Show how the state formulas limit what the district keeps. And then finally to clear up some myths and misconceptions about taxes and recapture. So this slide here is just to kind of show you a graphical representation of where our money comes from. So you can see the big blue piece of the pie down there. That's our local tax collections. And it represents about 87% of our total budget, our total revenue coming in. The second largest piece is a little purple sliver up there, which is state funding, and it's just a little over 7%. And so one of the things that you can kind of keep in mind is the relationship between local tax collections and state revenue. It's an inverse relationship. If one goes down, let's say local tax collections go down, as we'll show later in the presentation, state revenue should go up to offset that difference. And so the tax rates.
Sorry, on that pie chart, what was the other pieces? How do those get factored in?
So we have a little bit of interest on our investments. So that's like when we get our tax money, we don't use it all at the same, all in December, January when we get it. So we put it in our, a lot of it goes into what's called investment pools. And so we earn a little bit of interest on that. Other local sources, you go to a football game, you pay you buy a ticket, you go to a show, you buy a ticket. We have, some other book fines, just parking fees, those type of things, or other local sources. And then federal, we get a little bit of money from some federal grants. And so that kind of rounds out the bulk of everything. And so the tax rate, you may or may not know, the total tax rate of the district is actually broken up into 2 parts. One of the parts, the big part, maintenance and operations, that's the day-to-day business of the district. It's basically payroll, utilities, supplies. Our recapture payments are actually part of that M&O rate, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But then the other part of the tax rate is our interest and sinking, which pays the principal and interest on bonded debt. So when you go out and approve a bond for the district, as we did here recently, to build a new school or do renovations like what's going to happen at this campus, then that part of the tax rate, the interest and sinking, is what we levy to pay the debt and the interest on those payments. And so if you think of them kind of like as buckets, your M&O for this year is 0.7552 and your INS rate is 0.35. And again, the M&O goes over just general operations of the district. It's payroll, supplies, transportation, utilities, and athletics and extracurricular. On the INS side, again, it's principal and interest payments on voter approved bonds. And so a lot of times you may hear the term penny on the tax rate. And so really what it means, it's just what one individual penny on the tax rate would bring in income. So for our district, the amount of money that we would gain or lose if the rate went up or down for a penny for 2026 is just a little over $1 million. Our current M&O rate is 0.7552, which translates to 75.52 pennies. Now, 8 of those pennies are considered golden, and 5.83 of the pennies are considered copper, and that's important to keep in the back of your mind when we go over recapture. The remaining pennies, they're just plain pennies. And our current INS rate again is 35 cents, which translates to 35 pennies. And again, you often gauge how much 1 penny on the tax rate will bring in revenue. So our M&O rate is basically broken up into 2 parts, a Tier 1 and a Tier 2 rate. Our Tier 1 rate is called a compressed maximum rate, and by law we have to levy that. That's a calculation that TEA actually provides to the district, so it's not something that the district determines, it's something that is calculated for us based on information that we turn into TEA. For our district, of the 0.7552 pennies, 0.6169 pennies is considered our maximum compressed rate as calculated by TEA. The golden pennies, we have 8 of them, and they are all part of our 0.7552 rate. 5 of those golden pennies can be levied without voter approval. 3 of the pennies, in addition to any copper pennies, has to have voter approval. And I wasn't here in the district when that happened, but my understanding is back in 2016, thank you, that the taxpayers of the community voted to increase the tax rate. And then INS, those pennies again are set by the board to service existing voter debt. Now it's important to notice in Tier 1 and Tier 2 on the copper pennies, those are subject to recapture. Your golden pennies and your INS pennies are not subject to recapture. And we'll touch on that here in a little bit. So, how do you calculate your property tax? Well, this is the formula here on the left, and these are the components that make it up here on the right. So you take the market value of your property, you decrease it by exemptions, such as homestead over 65, disabled, and you get a net taxable value. That's the value that you're taxed on. You divide that value by 100, and then you multiply it by the tax rate. And then that's essentially the property tax bill or the income that comes to the school district. And so on your exemptions, typically your homestead exemption, that's the biggest exemption out there, the most common one. And in Texas, it's a primary tool for property tax relief. Any increase in the homestead exemption has to have voter approval through a constitutional amendment. And if you'll remember, this past month of November, there were several constitutional amendments out there, and there was one out there that increased the homestead exemption from 100,000 to 140,000, which did pass. And then for homeowners that are age 65 or older or disabled, there was an additional an exemption of $10,000, and that was increased voter approval past that to $60,000. So for a person that's over 65, the total exemption for homestead is now $200,000. And so when your exemption increases, you know, as a taxpayer, you see lower taxes. For a school district, a higher exemption means lower taxable values, which means lower M&O money coming in. And so if you'll remember the pie chart at the beginning, where we were at 87%, since the exemption went up, the tax base is going to go down, but the state has to kick in more money. And so that's what has happened here with the passage of that in November. And so here's an example. When you look at, I want to say roughly the average market value of a home in Dripping Springs ISD was $700,000 around. At a $100,000 homestead exemption, your net taxable value was $600,000. Divided by 100, you get $6,000. You multiply it by the tax rate, which again is your 0.619 plus 0.8 plus 0.583 plus 0.35. All of those add up to the 1.1052. So your tax bill would have been $6,631 on a $700,000 home. With the homestead exemption, all things being equal, just the homestead exemption goes up to 140, you can follow down with the same calculation. Now your tax bill is at $61.89. So on a $700,000 home, a $40,000 increase in the homestead exemption saved about $442 on a tax bill.
But people might not feel that. It just depends on, you know, our property values, are we gonna appraise higher than last year to this year? So the $400 may just cover like the inflation of your property values rising. So,
Right.
so don't be surprised if you get your property,
Right.
your tax bill and it does not feel $400.
And that's why I said all things being equal. And so the property market, the market value of the property, that's something that the district
Right.
doesn't control.
Right, the appraisal.
That's your appraisal district. But this past year, all those appraisals came in prior to. So in this case, or in this scenario here, the 700,000 still remains the same because this is just showing what a $40,000 increase
Right.
would
And this
show.
is only your school taxes, so remember, wherever you
Yeah.
live, you have county, city, MUD, emergency services, so you have a lot of other entities on your total tax bill.
Right. And so then this calculation is for a homeowner that's over 65. You can see it was 110, so it was 10,000 extra, and now that went to 60, so 140 and 60. That's where you get the 200,000 from. And so in this scenario, same calculation, just bringing it all the way down, you can see before the exemption went up, it was 6,500. Afterwards, it's 5,500, so almost $1,000 savings on a tax bill.
And if they turn 65, like maybe if they're 70 to 75, they may even have a lower tax. Well, because we haven't had a 2016 went higher, but what I'm getting at is once you turn 65, your tax rate is frozen, right?
Your tax bill is frozen.
So you might have even more savings depending on what that number is.
What I'm not clear on, last time we had an election, there was also a recalibration of those frozen levies, because if you turned 65 before 2019, you were stuck at the higher tax rate.
Uh-huh.
And so there was legislation to go back and recalculate those at the lower school tax rates. Now that the homestead exemption, that will be recalculated, I'm assuming, but there wasn't a specific bill to recalibrate that, so.
Excuse me, but since it's frozen and the taxes, the total taxes are quite a bit lower, I'm not sure this even affects you. If your taxes are frozen at, say, half of that, this is not gonna really reduce, it reduces $1,000 here, but I don't think it affects the frozen rate.
That's what Elaine
That's what
was
I'm
saying, like,
It took legislative action to recalibrate those to 2 years ago. I haven't seen legislation that recalibrates this, so it is probably more applicable to people that are turning 65 now and in the future. Because your other, if you've already been 65,
Yeah.
your
But it
levy
may,
was frozen.
it should still, like, you should get 200,000 off of your value.
So if you were paying 3,000 in taxes when you turn 65,
You're
you're
still-
paying 3,000 in taxes
Okay.
forever. Until the last time they did this, they said, let's go back and readjust that, and there was a major adjustment.
So
There
was
wasn't
it-
a major adjustment in the bill that I'm aware of for people that turned 65 2 years ago.
It's kind of like that home loan where it moves, what's that called?
Variable rate.
Yes. Like you may have gotten in at a bad rate.
When some things too, Elaine, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you are paying, like in Elaine's example, $3,000, but let's say you do some major renovation to your home or
Then
something
you
like
get
that,
reappraised,
that
yes.
kicks it in, so
Yes.
that's, I mean, this is important still for, like Elaine was saying, when you turn 65, or if
Yes.
you know, you may buy a house, like my mom and dad bought a home after they were 65, and so this all kind of comes into play with that as well. And so, are there any questions, other questions about the taxes before we move on? There's a test afterwards.
You're gonna calculate everybody's tax bill.
Well, no, I was gonna let them calculate.
No, they're gonna
Oh, okay.
calculate their tax bills.
I got my calculator. So what is recapture? Okay, so in Texas, recapture is the process that some districts send some of their local tax dollars back to the state. It was known as Chapter 41 or Robin Hood, which, you know, rob from the rich, give to the poor, or it was also called excess wealth. In 2019, the legislature, with House Bill 3, they updated the school finance formulas. Chapter 41 was recodified into Chapter 49 and given a new name. It's now called Local Revenue and Excess Entitlement. And so this applies when a district's Tier 1 local share exceeds the amount of what the state formulas say you can keep. The intent of recapture is to kind of spread the wealth, or basically so that every school in the state of Texas receives equal funding, or close to equal funding for every student, whether you're in Dripping Springs or, you know, in McAllen in the Valley. You should receive the same amount of funding per student. And this you'll see here in a second. Recapture payments have gone up so much that the state now uses some of the money to offset its obligation for state funding, and they're able to free up dollars to move elsewhere in the state's budget.
Because where do they put that recapture into? What line item does it go into the state?
It all goes into the big pot.
Into the general fund, so
Yeah.
it's not going into the education line, right? Like, that it has to go back to schools? No,
Technically,
sure
no.
not. Are you gonna talk about, how, I guess maybe it was in 2019 when they changed the recapture to now include like the land that they have? So like, why is Houston ISD, Dallas ISD, Austin ISD? It's because of like, now they're taxed on like the land values? Cause to me, those are like more lower income districts, but now they're paying millions of dollars in recapture.
Well,
Land has always been part of your value of property. Dallas, Houston, they all started going into recapture because their Tier 1, their tax collections are more than their Tier 1 share. And traditionally, they've been losing students, and so your Tier 1 is calculated based on the number of students in your district. So if you're a large urban and you're losing losing students, but your property values are going up, that's putting them into recapture.
And so in law, there's 5 options to reduce the excess revenue levels. Option 1 is called consolidation by agreement with another district. Essentially, you and another district are now one district. Option 2 is detachment and annexation by agreement, or basically property that's within the tax roll of one district is removed and given to another district. Option 3, and this is the one that most people do, it's purchase of attendance credits. So essentially you're buying credits from the state by sending them your excess money. Option 4 used to be used quite a bit, but that was when you could partner with another district, and essentially you're giving the district state money, and then the state does not give the district that. In the old days of Chapter 41, you would get a credit. So a lot of people would do that because the district that was paying the money would get a credit against and would be able to keep some of it.
Was that maybe like Colleen and Temple? Like,
Yeah. When I worked at Wimberley ISD, when we became Chapter 41, we partnered with 2 districts in South Texas, and we essentially sent them money, and then that was reduced from their state aid, but then we got like a credit, so it was advantageous to us because we saved a little bit.
and it went like directly to the schools.
Right. And then 5, tax-based consolidation. You're basically taking the levies of both districts, combining them, and then divvying it out. The drawbacks with that is you have to come up with a common rate and all that between the 2 districts. And as I said, number 3 is the most common one. It's called purchasing attendance credits, but essentially it's buying the ADA that the district would need in order to not pay or be considered Chapter 41, but you're essentially just sending the money to the state. And pretty much all districts do this option because it's by far the easiest one to deal with. And this is a graph for recapture statewide. It goes back to 1994, and you can see the high point in 2023 where all districts statewide were sending in about $4.5 billion back to the state. It dropped significantly into 2024, and that's due in large part to the homestead exemption going from 40,000 to 100,000. And then again, you'll see another drop in 2026 because the homestead exemption went from 100,000 to 140,000. So every time the homestead exemption drops, your tax base gets smaller, which that means there's not a lot of recapture then coming in to the state, but the state still has to pony up the money for the districts. It's kind of a scary scenario. I don't know how, one of the things that I know the governor's been talking about is just doing away with school property tax. That would be great. We wouldn't have a recapture, we wouldn't have to have a tax and all that, but how's the state going to make up, even $4.5 billion of money that's coming in? And this is a graph that shows Dripping Springs recapture history, and it kind of follows the same pattern. You can see a high mark there, $24 million in 22-23, and then it went down because of passage of the homestead exemption. And it's basically as your property values rise, you're going to see an increase in the payment. And there again in 26, it dips down because of the homestead exemption increase, going from 100,000 to 140. And this graph just kind of shows the relationship between taxes collected and recapture. So at this point right here, Dripping Springs had 89 million in collections, but had to send back 24. So you really see a net of the difference between those two and what the district's able to spend on programs. And here you're seeing 73 million with a $3 million payment. So we're netting a little over 70 million in local tax collections. Okay, so there's a little video here that I wanted y'all to see, and this kind of gives a graphical representation or a visual representation that may do a little bit better than my slides here in a second, but I think you'll kind of get the idea.
Think of public education funding in Texas like a glass of water. The size of the glass is based on the amount of money that the state of Texas says each school district should have. School districts serving more students have a bigger glass. School districts serving fewer students may have a smaller glass. Student and district characteristics can also increase the size of the glass, and so does the district's tax effort. Local property tax revenue is like water flowing in. Some districts cannot fill their glass with local tax revenue, so the state provides the revenue to fill it up. Sometimes the water from local tax revenue spills over. This is known as recapture. The state comes in and soaks up all the water outside the glass.
I like that.
So how do we reduce recapture and stop so much water from overflowing? Well, you could pour less water, but that would mean a decline in property values, and that's not good for the economy. Reducing the tax rate can also mean less water flowing into the glass if the state reduces the tax rate. But if the local school district reduces the tax rate, that can shrink the glass, which means just as much water outside the glass subject to recapture, but less water in the glass to educate students. Or there is another way. Let's make a bigger glass. Let's make sure every school district's glass is full. If it's not filled with local property taxes, then the state should pour in the rest of the water. What we don't need is the water from our local property taxes spilling out of the glass and making a mess.
So it's important to note.
On your previous graph, it would be interesting to plot, I know you can't do it right now, it would be interesting to actually plot that difference. So we could see how much each year the district spends. That would be the correct, right?
Yeah, I can do that. In the little video, it's important to note, and we'll kind of get to this in some of the misconceptions, but you may say, well, if our tax rate is bringing in too much money, then we have to send it back to the state. Why don't I just lower the tax rate? Well, you could, but the state has, in law or in statute, if you do that, then they proportionately will reduce your basic allotment. So when they were talking about reducing the tax rate, it causes your class to shrink. And we'll kind of get to that here in a second, but essentially you would be penalized. And so that rate that we were talking about earlier, the maximum rate that TEA calculates, you have to assess that rate. You don't have a choice. So what determines recapture? Well, our funding formulas, they determine how much revenue a district generates in revenue. It's based on student counts, the type of students, and certain district characteristics. That's what you may have heard at our first Taxpayer Tuesday when we talked about Tier 1, our entitlement. That's That's the size of the glass. Our tier 1 determines how big of a glass we have. Our tier 1 taxes that are collected by assessing that maximum tax rate, it's measured against what we should be able to keep or what we earn, and then what's in excess of that then essentially is what goes back to the state. And so, you know, that's exactly kind of what I was talking about. When your local tax collections exceed the amount generated as necessary to fill the glass, that's what goes back. Size of the glass is based on students and formulas. The level of tax collections are measured prior to what the state kicks in. And then recapture only applies to taxes collected for maintenance and operation purposes, not golden pennies, not INS. So here is all the components that go into the calculation of our tier 1 entitlement. It's our basic allotment. You can see the basic allotment up here, and then each one of these special programs have associated weights and allotments that come into play to determine or calculate the size of our glass. So all of these components come into play to consider what our tier 1 entitlement is. And so in this graph here, the size of our glass, again represented by tier 1, it's the revenue that the district gets to keep. And so a couple of examples here. Scenario 1, let's say that's our glass. And our tax collections, our tier 1 tax collections are less than our tier 1 entitlement. So that means that we should receive a little bit of state aid. And so this kind of shows that. Our tier 1 entitlement is the total glass, but our tax collections over here in green did not fill the glass up all the way, so the state would kick in some money. The little red component at the bottom doesn't come into play with Chapter 41. Every school district in the state of Texas is supposed to get available school funds. But it does go into consideration of how much is in your glass. Scenario 2, tax collections equal our tier 1 entitlement. So that means no state aid. And so here you can see our total tax collections is equal to what our glass is, and there's no state aid, there's no room in the glass, so the state doesn't kick in anything. And then this last scenario, which is us, our tax collections are greater than what our tier 1 entitlement is. We still don't get any state aid, but now we have to pay money back. And so here you can see our tier 1 entitlement on the left, where the black line is, the total tax collections. The yellow part is what gets sent back to the state, or in the little video, the state comes and soaks it up. So tier 2 money, you heard me talk about the golden pennies. Well, there's no recapture on the golden pennies. We get $129.52 per WADA, or weighted average daily attendance. The board can approve up to 5, and then voters are required to approve the next 3, which y'all have already done that. And the copper pennies, the reason they're called copper is because their guaranteed yield is slightly less than the 129.52. And recapture does apply to those pennies. And so here you can see in 24-25 and 25-26, our property value grew by 4.36% from 23-24 to 24-25. Our weighted average daily attendance was just a little over 10,000. Our guaranteed yield on those copper pennies was 129.52. And so our entitlement was a little over 10 million. The local taxes that we collected were 8. And so we were set to get an additional 1.6 million on that based on the guaranteed yield. Same thing in 25-26, our property values grew by 0.88%. That's due in large part to the homestead exemption going down. So from one year to the next, when you're comparing, you're not really comparing apples and apples as apples and oranges because it's a different homestead exemption. Same thing, our level 1 entitlement was 10.8 million. Our local tax effort was 8.8. So state aid that we earned on those golden pennies was just a little over $2 million. Now when you come on and add the copper pennies, you can see the yield went up a little bit from 24.5 to 25.26. Now on here, our entitlement was 2.8 last year and estimated at a little over 3 million this year. But when you look at the local tax effort, we were bringing in on those little over 5 pennies, we were bringing in about 6.2 million last year, about 6.4 this year. And so essentially, we had to pay recapture on these copper pennies, 3.4 last year, 3.3 this year. And you may ask, well, why are we assessing copper pennies if we're having to pay money back? Well, this is this year's budget, which we tried to break out into our tiers, like our tier 1, tier 2 golden, tier 2 copper. And so essentially, when you look at the tax collections here of 6.4 million, if we're sending back 3, we're keeping about 3. But that 3 million covers all the programs for athletics and fine arts. Now that's not to say that we've identified athletics and fine arts as only getting that money. It's just when we went through all of our budget and we just added things up, those programs that were considered extracurricular totaled to just about 3 million. So you can see if we didn't assess the copper pennies, we would be short around $3 million on our budget to try to pay for those, or we would have to come up with other budget cuts to the tune of $3 million. So some common misconceptions. As appraised property values increase, school districts must have more revenue. Hey, I'm paying more in property taxes, therefore school district must have more revenue. It's not true. District's maintenance and operations revenue are determined by our tier 1 entitlement, not tax collections. And so back to this little graph, that's the size of our glass. But tax collections are not considered when calculating the size of the glass. Another one is lowering the tax rate will lower recapture paid to the state. In the little video, that's what they were talking about here. We have to tax at our maximum rate or our basic allotment is reduced, and that's in statute, the code that doesn't. Just lower the tax rate enough that you don't pay recapture. Well, as we talked about here just a while ago, golden and copper pennies are enrichment revenues to enhance basic programs. There's no recapture on golden pennies. You could reduce your copper pennies, but that means cuts to programs. Even though we're sending money back, we are keeping some money. Test time. What is the purchase of attendance credits? Nobody? Choice 3 of the 5 options to reduce excess revenue. How can a district get out of recapture?
Go to bond, maximize golden pennies.
If a district's property wealth per student or WADA drops below the state threshold, which usually means our tax base is shrinking, or we're getting enough students that we're not wealthy per student anymore, that could be enough to bring the ratio down. It's basically getting a bigger glass. More students means a bigger glass. Oh, dadgum, I already gave the answer. All right, bonus. If tax collections increase but student ADA stays the same, does our recapture go up or down? All right, that is today's Taxpayer Tuesday. There's 3 more. I've been told I'm doing academics, so I better go start figuring it out. Thank you all so much for joining. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, I can answer those now, or email me, call me, or get me after the little thing here.